Hello, my name is Scott Brown. I'm the Director of Strategic Partnerships in the College of Agricultural, Food, and Natural Resources at the University of Missouri. And I've been a long-term livestock economist at MU as well. And I appreciate the chance to visit with you all today about the market outlook for the cattle industry. 2020 has certainly been a challenging period, and we have to go no further than this slide to talk about COVID-19 and some of the effects that we see happening as a result of the outbreak of COVID-19. I like to start with this slide because, again, off the left-hand vertical axis here, we're talking about the prices received by farmers on the black line. Off the right-hand vertical axis, it's the consumer price index for food. You'll notice that although there's some delays, normally those two series move in lockstep with each other. Yes, the CPI for food moves with less volatility than we see at the farm level, which is not to be unanticipated. However, I want to draw your attention to what's been happening here since we talked about COVID-19 outbreak. So I sometimes say these prices between farm level and consumer level have become unhooked. There's been a lot of questions, cattle markets in particular. We've got a lot of concern about whether or not there's been maybe some anti-competitive pricing behavior going on. We're going to continue to watch Department of Justice work as DOJ looks into some of those issues. But I remind you, there are added costs associated with compliance with COVID-19, and that's beyond processing of beef. It's transportation. It's what's happening at the grocery store level, all those things adding costs. Until we can talk about COVID-19 being less on the front page, I think it's hard to narrow that gap between farm level prices and consumer level food prices, which for me says it's hard to get farm level prices to move higher until we can start to, again, remove some of that wedge that's grown between those prices of late. You have to go no further than just looking at the restaurant foot traffic to get a sense of what happened. And let's just remind ourselves that COVID-19 has created some unimaginable effects when you think about what's been happening to the restaurant side of the industry. When we really shut down in mid to late March, we talked about what's a 60% decline from pre-COVID-19 in that blue line. We did get some recovery as we moved through May and June of this year, as we talked about easing in some restaurants beginning to open again. But you'll notice that as more cases of COVID-19 begin to take effect, that we've really slid sideways and still down 20% relative to a year ago. We talk about getting that restaurant foot traffic back to more normal, and all of us have our own opinion about what normal looks like today. We could certainly talk about stronger demand for things like beef, and I think beef's often the thing I talk about. If I'm going to go out and have a really good meal, what was I going to have? I was going to go have a steak, and so I think this slowdown in sit-down restaurant foot traffic may certainly hurt cattle more than maybe some of the other commodities. I think we have to remind ourselves that we really haven't seen the effects of what's a tremendous slowdown in real GDP. You see the number here for 2020 and what it looks like relative to 2019. I just draw your attention back here to the problems that we saw during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, and that pales in comparison to what we're going through right now. And we really have to get out here to 2022 before we talk about recovery in income. So I will say that on top of that, stimulus matters here, and it's beyond direct stimulus for producers in terms of those that are without jobs. Are we going to continue to provide them with any kind of checks to help them get through? Because if we stop that stimulus, what's that mean in terms of demand for food products? So we really haven't seen much of that yet, and I worry about what that means in terms of a drag. As we change and look at the supply side of the industry, I think this is where we actually see some positive, and I focus right here on, if you look at the July 1 cattle report that we got out, almost a 1% decline in beef cow numbers in the U.S. That's good news in that I think we'll continue to see fewer calf crop, et cetera, as we move forward. So the supply side in better shape, especially relative to some of the other livestock industries that continue to grow. You see here, even the dairy industry talking about a half a percent growth. less supplies and what's a more uncertain demand environment, I think is certainly certainly a good thing, and I think that could be helpful to the cattle industry. I do hear a lot of drought discussion, more from the cattle side than anything else, and you see the August 11th numbers here. We've got some drought here in portions of cattle country in the U.S. Thank goodness that doesn't really show up in Missouri. We remember our own issues back in 2018, but I'm not sure that the drought will mean that much in terms of further liquidation of cow numbers, but we're going to want to watch this area of the country more carefully as we look ahead. If that drought expands in that part of the country, maybe it does mean something. With the slowdown, shutdown of processing plants, this graph just needs to remind us that we've backed cattle up a lot in this country. We've talked about much higher weights for much of 2020 relative to where we were in 2019, 35, 40 pound difference. That takes time to work through. I will say I am amazed how well the cattle processing industry has come back online. I think when we first saw many of that shutdown, slowdown as a result of COVID-19, there were a lot of thoughts that it would take months to get any kind of recovery. I saw we slaughtered 120,000 head of cattle, I believe today, so mid-August. That's a pretty phenomenal recovery from where we sit. Yet we're going to continue to talk about heavyweight cattle for a period of time, which just adds to overall beef production. So although we have animal numbers down, we're going to have a continued drag from higher slaughter weights. This is not me being critical of USDA, but all the way back in May of 2019, what was USDA saying for 2020? And we'll just look at fed cattle prices here off the left-hand axis. USDA was saying, hey, we're talking about fed cattle prices that $121 hundredweight, and they really held that through much of 2019 into the start of 2020, and you see the effects of COVID-19. So we went from what was kind of in that 116 to 118 range all the way down to $1.04 pretty quickly. We have seen some recovery, and I'll say a nice sideways motion. We're more than halfway through the year now, so I think we have a good chance to keep cattle prices kind of where we sit now. So we've been in that $1.05 to $1.10 range for the last few weeks, and so hopefully that'll continue, and maybe even some strengthening as we go to the end of the year. But it has been quite a change as a result of COVID-19. You see the big impacts in cattle feed yards. So this is cattle on feed, 1,000 plus capacity. 2020 relative to 2019, we saw a huge reduction, some of the largest reductions we've ever seen relative to previous year for a couple of months. And as we've seen recovery, we've seen cattle on feed numbers back to where we were in 2019. So slowly working through what was a backlog of calves out there. I think this issue is not going to go away anytime soon. You see the large spread between farm and wholesale levels. There's a lot of different ways to calculate the spread between farm and wholesale, but suffice to say we had record levels of spread in May of this year. Some are questioning whether processors were taking advantage of the situation at the point in time. We certainly know there were additional costs associated with meeting COVID-19 restrictions, but we have come down back to where more normal, if you can find more normal these days in terms of that spread between farm and wholesale. We're going to continue to see Department of Justice work on that. We're also seeing U.S. Cattlemen's Beef Association talking about how to better price cattle, and I think a lot of that has to do with some of the effects that we're seeing as a result of the spread. We look at calf prices, which matter a lot for us in Missouri. I will say the nice thing is we're seeing 4 and 5 weight calves that are back to where we were in 2019. So some very good recovery now. For those that were waiting for the very large, higher prices that we'd have seen over that 2014 to 2018 period, I think we're a long ways away from that. The supply side has just grown a lot since what was a very short period of time back in 2014. So we'll wait and see what happens, but I'm holding out hope that as we get into the fall, we'll be able to hold feeder cattle prices at least at levels that we saw in 2019. I know that doesn't keep everybody in maybe a positive return situation, but maybe better than where we thought it was going to be when we were back in March or so of this year. If you look at our forecasts for both fed cattle and 5 and 5.5 weight feeder cattle for 2021, we'll actually talk about some positive, albeit small, increases in those prices. To me, the thing that keeps us from moving higher probably has a lot to do with just domestic demand and how it continues to drag as we see the overall economic picture in this country continue to drag. We do see lower prices for 2020. I think one of the things that could get us maybe higher prices than what I'm projecting is just what's happening on the export side of the equation. We've been fairly weak in a number of key countries on the cattle side, and perhaps as we talk about some of those countries also recovering from their own COVID-19 issues, we'll see a pickup in U.S. beef demand in those countries. Hopefully that'll give us a little more positive to talk about as we get into 2021 relative to what I'm talking about with you today. So I appreciate the chance to spend a few minutes talking to you about Cattle Outlook. If you have any questions, I sure hope you'll reach out to me. And I hope as we look ahead, we get more positive news in terms of prices for our many cattle producers here in Missouri. And again, please reach out if you have any questions.